Okay, welcome here back to Unit 6, Industry and Economic Development, and I'm going to see if I can burn my way through the last little bit of this slideshow, and it might be a little bit long, but I'm going to try and go all the way to the end with this one last quick video. So the last things we really need to talk about here are the competing economic models of development. There are two real categories of models of development. First are models that we tend to say are liberal, and then there are those models that we say are structuralist. Liberal models are the ones that basically assume that all countries are capable of development and that everybody is somewhere along that process. The structuralist models are more likely to view the world as kind of an is what it is kind of a concept, and that richer countries actually kind of prevent poorer countries from being able to develop because they manipulate them. So the biggest, most important of the liberal models is a guy named Walter Rostow, who worked in the Kennedy administration in the 60s, and he developed what became known as the Modernization model. It's sometimes called Rostow's ladder of economic development. Like a set of steps, it takes you over time from countries that are less developed and goes all the way out to those that are more developed. A really interesting unintended consequence for AP Human Geography students is that if you remember the demographic transition model, if you remember the epidemiologic transition model, these models can be superimposed and kind of laid on top of this model, and it really starts to give you a clearer picture of not just the economic issues of development, but also the social welfare indicators as well. The biggest of the structuralist models is a guy named Emanuel Wallerstein. Similar time frame to Walter Rostow, but a different political outlook of the world. Wallerstein proposed that the world is a single global economy. He says that the world has been that way since about the 1450s. It's probably not going to change a whole lot. Not that countries cannot develop, but that the richer ones are basically manipulating their competitive advantages, which prevents the lesser developed ones from being able to compete. Make sure you look at your David Palmer Blue Book, because both of these models are very well covered, and especially they do a good job of talking about criticisms of the model, limitations of the model, and where we can go from there. Here is Rostow's ladder of economic development, sometimes called the modernization model. Follow with me. You start in a traditional stage, pre-modern, very little economic development at all. Subsistence agriculture. This could be the informal side hustle economy, where not everything is measured by GDP. As a country develops over time, the preconditions for takeoff are starting to become present. We shift into a business class. Agriculture becomes more commercial and less subsistence. Productivity goes up because of new technologies. As we get up to stage 3, like an airplane, preconditions for takeoff, then the takeoff stage. This is the turning point. Manufacturing, so going out of primary and into secondary. New investment, usually from outside the country. This is where we start to see real big economic growth. Stage 4, the drive to maturity. Now we start to sustain this economic growth, industry and urbanization, the beginnings of services. And then level 5, guess where we are? High mass consumption. High levels of both productivity and consumption. 2/3 or more of the economy is the service sector. High per capita incomes. This is literally from traditional to modern, from poor to rich. One thing to realize about this model, it's purely economic. It does not address political factors, doesn't address cultural factors, doesn't address social factors. It's purely an economic development model. So how would epidemiology and the demographic transition kind of fit onto this? Well, it's hard for me because I can't make it transparent. But look, again, over time, as you go from this stage 1, remember there are no countries like this in the world today. This would be that really traditional stage for Rostow. Stage 2, the preconditions for takeoff. Notice the death rate is falling as a country moves out of agriculture and into industry, right? Then the birth rate's falling. We're now in a stage 3, moving out to stage 4 and into stage 5 of Rostow. Remember, demographic transition also has a stage 5 as well now, where elderly people start to die. So you could literally kind of overlay one of these models onto the other, and you could see that they really legitimately kind of complement each other in that sense. Disease is the same way. What kinds of diseases do the poorest countries have? Infectious diseases. What happens? Receding pandemics as they get better medical care. What happens? As they grow older, they have more chronic disease and less infectious disease. Life expectancies are longer. Then you get the reemergence of infectious diseases at the end. And this is why everybody's terrified about a coronavirus that's probably already starting to slow down in its transmission rate. So this is where I really need you guys to see connections between Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 5, and now into Unit 6, looking ahead to Unit 7 with urbanization. What are some of the limitations of Rostow? I already said it. It only examines economic indicators, doesn't consider anything else. It also only examines one country at a time. He puts every country on a curve. The fact that every country is on his ladder means that he assumes that everybody can develop. But the reality is, will they? Right? But he only looks at one country at a time. He doesn't consider that Mexico, being right next door to the United States, might help them. He also doesn't consider that Iraq, being right next door to Iran, might actually hurt them, because he doesn't look at it as a global system. He's looking at it at the national scale. Okay? So when you start looking at other models, this is the Wallerstein idea, the world systems theory. Whereas Rostow was looking country by country by country, Wallerstein looks at it as one single, interdependent, globalized system, a world systems theory. Now, you've heard me talk before about core, periphery, semi-periphery. This is what we mean by core periphery models. Remember, core is not always in the middle, periphery is not always on the outside. So when we think about Wallerstein's world systems theory, he's saying that ever since 1450, when Europe started to colonize and explore, Portugal, Spain, France, the English, they started to use their comparative advantages to subjugate and enslave the poorer people of the world, the less European people of the world, Africa, Latin America, Asia. Today, we can still see the legacy of that in what we talked about with the Brandt line. The countries that are the more European and the more well-off economically still control the global economy today. Now, this doesn't mean that there won't be like a Japan or a South Korea. They've been able to achieve development, usually, though, by copying the Western European kind of idea of development, and that would be industry and urbanization. So the biggest arrangement, or the biggest advantage of this core periphery arrangement, is that it can be interchangeably applied, not just at a global scale, but even regionally. Even within a country, you can talk about core periphery. Think about China, that noodle line. North of the noodle line, Chinese people eat pasta. South of that noodle line, it's rice. The part of China that's more economically developed, obviously the eastern third, but also that northeastern portion as you get up towards Beijing, Shanghai, and you're moving out there into the industrial area of Manchuria, and less developed as you go into the southern part of the country, especially southwestern China, right, where you don't have as much of that manufacturing. But clearly, coastal areas most important of all. When we look at the global economy in the Wallerstein model, right, you could clearly see the core. That's your Brandt line, right? You could see the semi-periphery, and hey, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? South Africa, if we make it plural. The mint countries, Mexico, Indonesia, maybe would be changed to a more of a yellow here. Nigeria, maybe changing a bit to a yellow here. Obviously, Turkey, again. Look at the ones that are peripheral, truly peripheral, the ones that really are not yet plugged into this global economy as equal participants. They're the ones that are being exploited for their resources, for their agricultural productivity, whereas the yellow ones turn around and they exploit the poorer ones, just like the core kind of exploits the semi-periphery for things like cheap labor in terms of low value added goods, like we've been talking about in the industry section of these slideshows. Here's that Brandt line. Remember, we could also do a down and dirty line by just making the equator the difference maker between those that are more developed and those that are less developed. Don't forget, we call it global north, global south. If you're north of the Brandt line, you're rich. If you're south of the Brandt line, you're poor. Remember, Australia, New Zealand, always the exception to that Brandt line theory. So the dependency theory, this is another kind of interesting thing. Rostow said that all countries are on a single path. Sometimes we see countries today where there are countries that probably could develop, but they're being held back. Sometimes they're being held back by rich people in their own country, because these elites, the ones that are really, really wealthy, and you see this a lot in Africa where you have dictatorships and people who manipulate the business economy, especially the formalized GDP economy. They own so much, and that they control all access, and they keep their country poor on purpose, because they know that if the country stays poor, they'll stay in power, they'll stay wealthy. They also know that richer countries will continue to inject money into those countries because they're poor, and sometimes these people are misappropriating and mishandling this finance. There's a lot of graft, a lot of corruption, a lot of embezzlement of money in poor countries. Not that it doesn't happen in rich countries too, but it's systemic and endemic in poor parts of the world. So this is where we see this idea of a dependency theory. Sometimes we talk about neo-colonialism, that there's no longer this political control of these poor countries, but instead we've replaced the political manipulation with an economic system of control, which is called neo-colonialism. And this is what we mean: using our military power, using our money, controlling the import-export, using the global division of labor. All of these are ways that dependency today has basically replaced the old imperialism of the 1800s, but it really hasn't changed the reality that those in the core are basically manipulating those that are in the periphery. So this brings me to my discussion real quick about the Sustainable Development Goals. Originally, there was the Millennium Development Goals, where in the latter part of the 20th century, 21st century, we're in now, the 21st, the latter part of the 20th century, the UN got together and they said, we want to set some goals for the year 2000. And they wanted to cut poverty in half. They wanted to cut hunger in half. And these were ambitious goals. Many people thought, oh, these people are crazy. They're never going to cut poverty in half. The reality is we have cut poverty in half by percentage. Now, remember, there's 7.6 billion people in the world today. 12% are in extreme poverty. In the 50s, there were only 4 billion people in the world, and 50% of the people were in poverty. So yeah, we've cut poverty, but there's still a billion people or so living in difficult, multidimensional, extreme poverty. So the new goal is by 2030, right? The original goal was by 2015. We're past that now. So the new goal is that by 2030, they want to eradicate poverty, eliminate hunger, stop the spread of HIV/AIDS, ensure environmental sustainability, universal primary education for children. You can go look up the 17 different sustainable development goals. We'll probably do a little fourth quarter progress report on that, which will be interesting when I get back from Europe after spring break. But remember what the keys are. Education of girls, all right, education in general, but particularly of girls. Gender empowerment is a big issue. We've been watching Don't Panic, where Hans has been talking about development. And in his book, Hans talked about his favorite number being 0. And that's because we want zero poverty, zero hunger, zero HIV/AIDS. So having a favorite number of 0 is a way of saying this is achievable. Now, it's not just about throwing money at the problem. You have to change the multidimensional poverty. You have to access education. You have to access empowerment for girls. You have to be able to create the conditions where extreme poverty can be eliminated. Remember, ending extreme poverty doesn't mean these people are going to be equal to us. It just means that they're going to be making more than that $1.90 a day or so in purchasing power parity. If you can get them to $3, $4, $5 a day, their incomes will be so much better. And remember, Hans always talks about the 1 and the 10 and the $100 that we talk about as income levels. Well, you notice that each time you're multiplying by 10. And I don't care how wealthy you are. You tell me that somebody comes up to your family and adds a 0 on the end of your family's income, or the end of your family's house price, or the end of your car price. You're telling me your life doesn't change when you add a 0? All right, can you imagine going from, say, $100,000 a year of income to $1 million a year? Even if you were at $1 million, 10 million is not going to change your life. Think about it. It's an incredible number. One thing we need to remember, we at $100, we look down at 1 in 10, we think they're all the same. Nothing could be further from the truth. Trust me, the person on $1 a day looks up at 10 and thinks that person is mega rich. Here are those 17 development goals. You're more than welcome to pause and take a look at them. Consider how these will affect the economic, the social, cultural, the political, and the environmental, site and situation factors of the world, how it will change human geography in general, right? These are really important to look at these. And then think about what the barriers are. Let's be honest, as you read through this slide, this is what's stopping us from achieving the goals. Both people living in rural places as well as people living in urban places, right? If we could solve these problems singly, we would be able to get to a sustainable development goal future by the year 2030. Another group that's working towards this is, of course, other non-governmental organizations. Remember that governments sometimes can't achieve consensus. They can't get everyone to agree how to do it. Political parties argue about the process. Sometimes bad governments can't even get anything done through either incompetence or corruption or both. So these NGOs will sometimes put money to work directly where the problem is, often through what they call participatory development. They get the local people to help building a well. The local people help to build a school or a medical clinic. The local people help to build infrastructure projects. The local people help to provide schooling for girls. And when the people involved in it are those that also benefit from it, they're more invested, they work harder, they're more faithful and loyal to the project. What do they need, though? They sometimes need money. We're not talking big amounts of money. Sometimes this is what we call microcredit or microfinance. It might only be a couple of $100, but for a person living on about $1 a day, a couple $100, guys, we're talking that's 6 months, sometimes even a year of income. You could open a business, do a little entrepreneurial activity, could be the side hustle, could be something that provides jobs for your neighbors, people in the village. All right, so again, all of this, it's not just economic. It could be environmental. It could be about preserving the rainforest. It could be about fighting wildfires. It could be about combating climate change, helping farmers out with their crops. So it doesn't have to be even economic. It can be social, it can be cultural, it can be political, it can be environmental. Of course, the fabulously wealthy are doing a huge job here as well. Remember, most of the big billionaires in America have made that Warren Buffett pledge. He was the first to do it, where they've pledged to give away 90% of their wealth while they're still living. The big name lately, Bill Gates and his wife, Melinda. If you think about it, when you start to get these, and I don't mean billionaires, these are people with hundreds of billions of dollars, when you start to see the impact that that money can make. But it's not just throwing the money at it. It's like clean water initiatives. Bill Gates is a big believer in providing sanitation, flushable toilets for the poorest people in the world, because it could then impact disease rates. And when people aren't sick, they can work harder, be more productive, learn more, go to school, and it would create, again, a better life. So this is what we mean by microcredit. And one big thing here, if you get this essay question, most microfinance goes to women. And that's because women usually work together better. They help each other out more. They're more faithful about the repayment of the money, but it sometimes can create issues with their husbands, because the husbands are like, well, wait a second, how come she got the money? I'm the man of the house. So in some of these small villages, particularly in South Asia, these little online banks, Grameen Bank is a great example of this. People are putting cash directly in the hands of people who need it most, and these women are then paying it forward and helping others to achieve a better life. In terms of environment, debt for nature swaps. The rich investors are saying to the country that has debt, look, we're going to pay off your debt. But instead, you have to agree that the money you would have been paying on the debt, you're going to instead create environmental conservation preservation programs, right? So again, it might be saving pandas, it might be saving rhinos, it might be saving coral reefs and things like that, saving the rainforest. So the wealthy creditors are paying off the poor country's debt and saying, you take the money and instead invest it in preservation. You think about plastic pollution. This is one of my pet peeves here in the city of Boca. I can't get a plastic straw with my milkshake. You try sucking a milkshake through a paper straw, right? And you can tell by looking, Spacious Sharks had a few milkshakes. The reality is 95% of all the plastic that pollutes the world's waters, it's not coming from Boca Raton. And what's interesting is I can't get a plastic straw, but if I ask for a to-go cup, guess what? It's plastic. So when you look at where the plastic problems really are coming from, again, it's the poorest countries in the world. So why don't we help this area of the world rather than being a little more overly concerned about what's happening here in Palm Beach County? Remember, think globally, act locally, right? Recycling efforts, we don't do a very good job. I got to be honest with you, sharks. You people can't read the box in my room that says plastic and cans. You can't read the box that says paper only, because almost every time those environmental club kids come around, those two boxes have been commingled with all kinds of recyclable materials. So we really should be doing a better job to be green. Look at air quality. This is one of the most famous air quality cities in the world. It's Mexico City. Surrounded by tall mountains, it's built into a bowl or a depression. This is a good day in Mexico City. City of 30 million people, most of them driving cars. Wait for it. Watch this. Same picture from the same building, a camera on top of the building. Look at the difference in air quality between a good day and a not so good day, right? Los Angeles used to be that poster child in America for poor visibility and poor air quality. Now, LA has really made steps to clean up their act. But also, in addition to Mexico City, places like Beijing, they were very concerned when the Olympics were in China about the air quality for example, marathon runners, right? Speaking of China, this is the Three Gorges Dam project. Again, look at air quality, but this is a hydroelectric facility. It's 600 feet tall. It's a mile long. It created a 400-mile reservoir of water behind it. Big, huge hydroelectric facility in the central portion of China, in the Three Gorges area near the city of Chongqing. But there are big problems here in the sense of a lot of erosion problems, but also this is a particularly seismic part of China. And what happens if an earthquake strikes? China says this dam is earthquake proof, but at the end of this river is the city of Shanghai, which is 30 million people. What happens if a gigantic wall of water comes down the Yangtze Basin? Also, don't forget your water cycle. I know you guys have had science class, and I'm going to try and speed up and finish here, but make sure you understand that water plays a big role in development, particularly in those areas that are dry, desertification, when you think about the Sahel region of Africa. And that's this. Remember, we talked about that great green wall that Africa is building. 11 countries across Africa at the foot of the Sahara and the edge of the Sahel are committed to planting 10 billion trees, if I remember correctly. Ethiopia's president famously was out there with a tree planting program. But this is, again, Australia with those wildfires that are going on. Even in the southwestern United States, California with their drought issues. This is a big issue in terms of environmental sustainability. Speaking of that, this is the Aral Sea, and again, famous photos here. The Aral Sea in the 1970s, the Aral Sea recently. This is mostly because of commercial farming, particularly of cotton, a lot of pesticide and chemical fertilizer use in the area of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, southern Russia. At the time, this was the Soviet era. Now these countries are independent. The Aral Sea has almost completely disappeared, and life cannot exist in these algae blooms. It's just so polluted and devastated and will probably never recover. So again, When you think about NGOs, it's not just about economic or social cultural or political. Sometimes it's also environmental as well. Okay, try to keep it under 25. I know it's long. Hey, take a break. Go make some popcorn. Come back and watch the end of the video, right? So you got your MCQ progress check coming up in class. Test on Tuesday. Let's be ready to go.